What if what the church called a devil was, in fact, an African god with the power to cure diseases that Western religion itself has never been able to explain? Have you ever wondered why so many ancient deities were demonized when Christian colonizers arrived in Africa? Why so many healing spirits revered for generations came to be seen as evil forces? And even more, what would happen if we discovered today that these entities the church tried to erase were, in fact, spiritual healers with real supernatural powers? Get ready, because what you're about to hear in this video isn't just a forgotten story, it's a revelation, a hidden truth, a spiritual mystery that has been silenced for centuries. We're talking about an African god, invoked by native peoples to heal physical and spiritual illnesses, with methods so powerful that even Christian priests were left without answers. This god, who to the missionaries was a demon, to his people was the personification of healing, wisdom, and vital energy. We're not here to attack religions. We're here to unearth the truth that has been buried under the weight of prejudice, colonization, and spiritual ignorance. You'll understand how African spirituality was attacked, demonized, and erased, not because it was dangerous to souls, but because it was too powerful to ignore. Historical archives, missionary accounts, and even occult records reveal healing practices that challenged European medicine at the time. People with unexplained chronic illnesses were treated through sacred rituals involving plants, chants, touch, ancestral prayers, and a deep connection with entities that, to this day, remain alive in African spirituality. What if I told you that many of these methods have been re-examined by modern science? That even with all the technological advances, doctors still can't explain how these cures worked? The name of this deity, his rituals, his symbols, everything was erased from the books, but not from the spiritual memory of his descendants. That's why we're here, to tell this story, to reveal the name, power, and essence of an African god who healed, but was called a demon. But before we continue, stop and reflect. Why are we so afraid of what is different? Why must healing from across the ocean be seen as heresy? What if the real miracle was silenced simply because it originated on African, not European soil? In this video, you will learn who was this African god and why was he labeled evil, how their healing rituals defied the logic of Western medicine, the reasons behind the spiritual persecution initiated by Christian missionaries, the parallels between the healing miracles reported in the Bible and the deeds of this forgotten deity, and most surprisingly, real proof that this spiritual power is still active today. This isn't just a story, it's a calling, an opportunity to open your eyes to a spiritual reality ignored for centuries. Are you ready to discover what the church never wanted you to know? Because what's about to be revealed could forever change the way you view good, evil, and the power of spiritual healing. And get ready, because what comes next will challenge everything you've ever heard about demons, gods, and miracles. But before we continue with this profound revelation, I have a simple but very important request. Leave a comment below telling me what you think about all this. Do you believe that African spirituality has been unfairly erased from history? Have you ever heard of cases where the sacred was confused with the profane simply because it came from a different culture? Your comment is more than an opinion. It's a form of resistance. It's a way of showing the algorithm that this type of content needs to be seen by more people, by those who are also searching for answers that traditional religion has never been able to explain. And since you've made it this far, it's a sign that this topic resonates with you. So, leave a like, because it helps the video reach more awakened people like you. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next revelations, because in future videos, we'll continue to unearth forgotten truths, forbidden mysteries, and spiritual secrets that can completely transform your perspective on faith, power, and ancestry. Here, you won't find more of the same. Each video is a spiritual and historical journey, and your presence makes all the difference. To understand why an African god with healing power was called a demon, we need to go back in time. We need to see the roots of the process that shaped, erased, and rewrote entire spiritual narratives. The arrival of Christian colonization in Africa was much more than a territorial invasion. It was a spiritual war disguised as evangelization. The colonizers didn't just come with swords and guns. They came with a new doctrine, a new language, a new way of understanding what is sacred and what should be condemned. Imagine entire villages living in deep connection with the earth, the elements, and ancestral spirits. Imagine respected healers, men and women who knew plants, songs, the cycles of nature, and the mysteries of the human soul. Now imagine all of this being classified as witchcraft. Imagine the drum being silenced, the names of the Orishas being forcibly forgotten, healing rituals being banned, persecuted, and destroyed. Everything that didn't fit within Christian theology came to be called the work of the enemy. And here's the key that almost no one talks about. This demonization was a power strategy. Europeans couldn't understand, and in many cases couldn't control, the spiritual effectiveness of African leaders. And when you can't control something, the quickest way out is to eliminate it. Call it evil. Call it dangerous. And that's exactly what happened. Divine entities, who for centuries had been revered as forces of healing, wisdom, and balance, began to be portrayed as demons, not because they were evil, but because they didn't belong to the dominant religion. Can you grasp the gravity of this? An entire civilization with its own spiritual system, its own cosmology, its own gods, was reduced to a caricature of evil. And worst of all, this still resonates today. Just look at how many people, even without knowing anything about African spirituality, react with fear, prejudice, or mockery when they hear names like Exu, Osiam, or Obaluaye. It's a direct reflection of centuries of spiritual colonization, centuries in which we were taught that anything that comes from Africa is dirty, wrong, or dangerous. But now think with me. What if this idea was always wrong? What if the cure you seek, the one modern medicine can't offer, is rooted in this ancient knowledge? What if these African gods were never demons, and the mistake was ours for failing to look with respect and depth at what we don't know? During colonization, confrontation was inevitable. Missionaries encountered practices that to them seemed like witchcraft, but which in practice cured illnesses, treated trauma, and restored health to body and spirit. They didn't understand the chants. They didn't understand the symbols. They didn't understand the power of their ancestors. And because they didn't understand, they feared, and fear led to persecution. Healers were persecuted, tortured, and killed, and along with them, part of the knowledge was buried forever. But not all was lost. Some knowledge survived in the shadows, in whispers among initiates, in the hands of mothers of Saint Babalorixas, priests, and spiritual leaders who resisted. They knew they were carrying something too sacred to be silenced, and even if they had to disguise their rituals, hide their altars, or adapt their chants to avoid punishment, the essence remained alive. And this essence is what we are bringing to light in this video. African healing systems are extremely sophisticated. They don't just treat the body, they treat the spirit. They understand that illness can originate from unresolved trauma, an energetic imbalance, or a separation from ancestors. Treatment is not just physical, but symbolic, ritualistic, and emotional. There is no separation between the sacred and the everyday. For Africans, healing is reconnecting. It's remembering who you are. It's rediscovering your place in the world and in the spiritual lineage from which you came. Now think, what happens to a culture that loses this connection? What happens to a people who are taught to be ashamed of their own gods? Who learn to hide their accès, to deny their ancestors, to distance themselves from their spiritual strength? This is not just a cultural loss. It is a loss of identity. And therein lies the most profound impact of religious suppression. It destroys the collective soul of a people. When the church arrived, imposing its dogmas and expelling everything that didn't fit its theology, it wasn't just preaching a new faith. It was erasing memories, canceling histories, interrupting cycles of ancient wisdom. And the result is visible to this day. A society that often seeks healing but refuses its own ancestral medicine. A people who feel a spiritual void but are unable to reconnect with the roots that were forcibly torn out. But what if you could reconnect? What if this video is the beginning of a reunion? Not with a new religion, but with an ancient wisdom. A wisdom that lives in your blood, even if you don't yet know it. A wisdom that speaks the language of earth, fire, water, and wind. That knows the rhythm of drums, the scent of leaves, the power of songs. A wisdom that heals, not just the body, but the whole being. So I want to invite you to do something simple. Share here in the comments if you've ever felt this calling. If you've ever felt that there's something deeper in the spiritual world than what you've been taught. You can write just one word, like awakening, or share your experience. I read everything, and this helps not only with engagement, but also with creating a community that thinks, questions, and feels. If this message resonated with you, comment below, "I feel the call." And if you know someone who grew up fearful of African spirituality but is ready to see things differently, send them this video. Among the many names silenced by history, one stands out in an almost mystical way, like an ancestral whisper echoing beyond time and persecution: Osanyan. This is no ordinary name. Osanyan, also called Osane, was not just a deity. He was the spirit of healing, the guardian of leaves, the master of the secrets of plants, and the natural power that resides in every root, every herb, every fragment of creation. In the Yoruba spiritual system, Osanyan holds absolute knowledge of the sacred pharmacopoeia. He knows which leaf soothes the spirit, which root banishes evil, which seed awakens the body, and which aroma reconnects the soul with its ancestors. Nothing that grows from the earth is invisible to Osanyan's eyes. For him, the forest is a living library, and each plant is a page written with divine energy. Ancient priests and initiates knew that the healing power lay not only in the physical substance of the plant, but also in the way it was invoked, harvested, prepared, and consecrated. The chants, called oriki, were not just cultural adornment. They were spiritual activators, words that awakened the latent energy of every element of nature. By chanting to a leaf, the healer was not only respecting its spirit, he was conversing directly with the invisible world. In the verses of the Odu Ifa, sacred texts of Yoruba wisdom, we find passages where Osanyan is described as having a single eye that sees all, and a single leg that supports all. But don't be fooled by this seemingly limited image. This symbolism speaks not of deficiency, but of concentrated power. Osanyan's eye sees what others cannot. His single leg stands firmly at the center of ancestral wisdom. He has no need to rush, for time bows before his knowledge. Osanyan's knowledge was not open to just anyone. It was reserved for the initiated, those who knew how to respect the mystery. He is revered to this day in several nations of African descent, especially in Afro-Brazilian religions such as Candomblé and Umbanda. His inscription, made of leaves, earth, iron, and secret symbols, is not just a ritual object, it is a point of living energy, a direct connection between the physical and spiritual planes. And why was this god called a demon? The answer, however harsh, is simple: because their power healed where European medicine failed, and their wisdom did not submit to the church's control. The missionaries viewed their rituals as witchcraft because they could not understand how a simple leaf bath could free someone from a high fever, how a word chanted with faith could stop a convulsion, how an offering placed in the forest could restore the spirits of someone overcome by profound sadness. And so, without understanding, they condemned. Without investigating, they exorcised. But if logic were truly applied, Osanyan should have been studied, not feared, because all he offered was healing, balance, and reconnection. His rituals didn't invoke pain, they invoked life. And we're not talking about myth. We're talking about real records, living practices, traditions that have endured through the centuries, even in the face of oppression. Have you ever heard the sound of a leaf blowing as it is reverently plucked? Have you ever been to a sacred forest where the silence is interrupted only by soft chants, sung to ask permission from the spirits of nature? This is Osanyan's environment, a place where healing is not just physical but spiritual, where the sick are seen not as broken, but as those who have lost balance with the whole. And this is precisely why Osanyan remains feared by those who do not understand, because his wisdom is beyond the reach of reason. And there's something even deeper to this. Osanyan represents spiritual self-sufficiency. He teaches that healing doesn't depend on intermediaries, grand temples, or commercialized rituals. Healing is in the land, in your backyard, in your ancestry. This directly confronts a religious structure that profits from dependency, that teaches that one can only be healed through a priest, an altar, a doctrine. With Osanyan, no. The land is the temple. The oriki is the prayer. The leaf is the sacrament. And if this sounds revolutionary today, imagine it during the colonial era. Imagine the fear that aroused in the hearts of priests when they saw entire villages gathering for a leaf ritual, in silence, in harmony, feeling their pains melt away, their bodies responding, their spirits calming. And that's where the oldest accusation in history comes in. This can only be the work of the devil, but it wasn't. It was wisdom. It was tradition. It was healing. And even today, it is. How many modern diseases arise from emotional imbalance? How many illnesses that destroy us from within could be alleviated if we reconnected with nature, with simplicity, with ancient knowledge? Are we looking for answers in the right place? Or is what we call alternative actually the origin of everything? The name Osanyin may not yet be widely known, but it needs to be, because his legacy doesn't belong solely to Africa. It belongs to humanity. He reminds us that healing is an ancestral right, and that the spiritual paths of the forest are as sacred as any stone cathedral. He reminds us that healing energy lives in the leaves, in words, in faith, and in respect. And most importantly, he shows us that what has been called demonic may actually be the closest thing to the divine. If you've come this far, feeling something awakened within you, comment below with the word ancestral healing. And if you've had any experience with leaf rituals, ancient prayers, or felt the power of a knowledge that predated the dominant religion, share it with us. These stories need to be heard, preserved, and valued. What most astonished, and even outraged, Western missionaries and doctors who first set foot on African soil wasn't just the existence of deities with unfamiliar names or spiritual practices that followed other logics. What truly disconcerted them was seeing, before their very eyes, people being cured without scalpels, pharmaceuticals, hospitals, or anything that fit the European logic of scientific medicine. They watched with astonishment and disbelief, feverish children smiling again after leaf baths and chants, women suffering from nervous breakdowns calming completely after a collective ritual of clapping, prayer, and dancing. Men with deep wounds on their bodies were treated with natural poultices, while the community invoked sacred words that seemed to activate something invisible, yet real. It wasn't magic in the pejorative sense of the word. It was spiritual knowledge combined with natural power. And the most misunderstood point was precisely this. African priests and healers treated not just the body, but also the person's spiritual field. They knew that behind an illness there was often an emotional imbalance, an energetic breakdown, an offense to an ancestor, a trauma that spread like an invisible poison. Therefore, true healing couldn't come solely from the outside in. It needed to come from the inside out, and also from the top down. It was a total integration of the physical, emotional, spiritual, and sacred. Imagine, for example, a man struck by sudden paralysis. While European doctors looked for physical causes, injuries, fractures, infectious diseases, local priests sought other answers. What did this man see? What did he hear? What was his last dream? Did he fight with someone? Break some taboo? Disrespect some force of the forest? This comprehensive approach not only broadened the scope of treatment, but also enabled the patient to become active in their healing process. They were not passive patients. They were spiritual participants. Healing often began with a request for forgiveness, a reconciliation with a family member, or a symbolic return to the place where their energy had been disrupted. The rituals involved the body, but also the soul. They involved fasting, silence, dancing, sweat, tears, chanting, and, above all, sacred leaves that were not chosen randomly, but revealed by the oracle, indicated by a spiritual guide, or communicated in a dream. The chants, in turn, were not just beautiful or folkloric sounds. They carried vibrational codes, names of strength, words of power. Each sound emitted had a function: to untie energetic knots, to break negative spiritual bonds, to awaken memories, to calm the spirit. It was common for the patient to enter a trance state during these chants, and in this state, the mind opened to energetic reprogramming, allowing healing to occur not only on a physical level, but also in subtle layers of existence. And yes, many of these rituals completely defied the colonizers' understanding. There are reports of infertile women becoming pregnant after rituals involving leaves and special baths prepared under moonlight, cases of partial blindness reversed after prayers and anointings with root mixtures, people diagnosed with diseases considered terminal, such as leprosy and ulcers, recovering in a matter of weeks. And most impressively, these cures were performed without cutting the skin, without handling industrial drugs, and often without touching the person, because touch, for many rituals, was unnecessary. The word was enough. The sound, the intention, the presence of the community gathered in faith. African spirituality knew what modern science is still beginning to study. that consciousness affects the body, that energy responds to sound, that the collective has immeasurable healing power. The missionaries didn't understand this, but the healers understood deeply, and for this, they were feared. Upon seeing these cures occur before their eyes, many Europeans remained silent. Others were afraid and tried to prevent the rituals, but a few, and this is recorded in diaries and field memoirs, were deeply moved, as if they had witnessed something that challenged the entire belief system in which they had been formed. And perhaps for this reason, many of these accounts were censored or never officially published, because admitting that a people considered backward could cure complex illnesses with leaves and songs would undermine the logic of colonial domination. These rituals, besides healing, restored something precious to people, a sense of belonging. At a time when Black people were enslaved, dehumanized, and torn from their lands, the simple act of being cared for by their own culture, with their own leaves, their own spiritual language, was a way of resisting, of surviving, of affirming their existence. And healing in this context wasn't just for the body. It was a political, social, ancestral healing. It was saying, I am sacred. My pain matters. My faith has power. The spiritual energy involved in these rituals cannot be explained solely in physical terms. It was common to see, for example, people in a state of spiritual possession entering the bodies of the sick to cleanse negative charges, to cut demands, as the popular saying went, or to guide them through visions where they received instructions directly from the Orishas on what to do. This may seem strange to those who have never had a genuine spiritual experience. But anyone who has felt the vibration of a drum in tune with their own heart knows there are greater forces at work here. And don't think this has been lost over time. These rituals still exist. They are still practiced. They still heal, but they are often kept hidden for fear of prejudice, misunderstanding, and veiled persecution. There are still people who rise from bed after years of deep depression after undergoing a ritual of leaves, chanting, and spiritual guidance. There are still those who heal physical pain with sacred baths and ancestral prayers. There are still, amidst the concrete and modern chaos, those who believe in and experience the invisible power of the Orishas acting with ancient wisdom. Therefore, it's urgent that we reclaim this knowledge, that we bring these stories out of silence, that we stop being ashamed to say we believe in something that science can't yet explain, but that the soul recognizes instantly. If this passage touched you, if you've experienced something similar or know someone who was healed through paths that conventional medicine has ignored, write the phrase, I believe in spiritual healing, in the comments. Or, if you'd like, share your experience. These comments not only strengthen our community, but also help spread this content to more people who need to reconnect with their sacred knowledge. What do you think happens when what is sacred to one people is seen as a threat by another? What happens when one person's miracle is another's scandal? It's precisely at this point that the story begins to take on even more intense dimensions, because there have been more than a few times when Christian priests have witnessed, with their own eyes, African healing rituals taking place before them, and they haven't known what to do. Imagine a scenario where a sick woman with severe symptoms, speechless and powerless, is taken to a village healer. There, without scalpels, pills, or crosses, she is laid on leaf mats, surrounded by chants, invocations, fresh leaves rubbed on points of her body, baths prepared with herbs gathered at dawn. And minutes later, this woman begins to move, to breathe deeply, to open her eyes, to speak. The eyes of those present shine, because they recognize they're a sign of living spiritual strength. But the eyes of the missionaries and priests observing this are filled with despair. They didn't see the Holy Spirit at work there. They didn't see a miracle. They didn't see grace. They saw witchcraft. And with this shallow judgment, they began to define what was divine and what was demonic based solely on the appearance of the ritual and not its effects. Even if the results were healing, deliverance, relief, restoration, the judgment was immediate. If it doesn't come from our God, then it can only come from the devil. And so began a brutal and systematic process, the symbolic extermination of African spiritual practices. But before the extermination came fear. Yes, because the priests of the church weren't faced with inventions. They saw power. They felt the atmosphere vibrate. They saw the sick rising. They saw the strength of the collective acting as a spiritual body. And this fear quickly transformed into repression, because institutionalized faith cannot tolerate what it cannot control. It's curious to see how fear arises from misunderstanding. European missionaries, trained within a rigid doctrine, had never encountered a spirituality that expressed itself through the body, through rhythm, through nature. For them, faith was silent, moralistic, based on guilt, fasting, and punishment. Seeing a faith that danced, sang, lived, and, above all, effective, completely shattered their mental frameworks. Culture shock was inevitable. How could they accept that a people considered savage could master ancient spiritual secrets that healed more effectively than the medicine they themselves brought? How could they understand that a woman in a turban, her hands covered in leaves, could touch someone's heart and free them from suffering that years of confession and penance had failed to erase? They couldn't understand, and so they attacked. And so begins one of the cruelest phases of our spiritual history: religious persecution legitimized by faith. Toreros were destroyed, settlements were burned, spiritual leaders were arrested, humiliated, tortured, and killed. Many were forced to baptize their practices with Christian names, hide their Orishas under the guise of Catholic saints, and disguise their chants as litanies. African spiritual survival was built on disguise, on silent resistance, on the hiding of leaves and words. There were places where rituals could only be performed at night, away from the eyes of priests. Others used popular festivals as an excuse to revere their ancestors, amidst the sound of atabake drums and disguised offerings. The fear was real, the risk was constant, but faith was greater. And this is something that needs to be recognized. It wasn't just the faith of the colonizers that built the continent, it was also the faith of the oppressed that resisted the attempt at erasure. And this faith, ancestral, black, profound, lives on to this day. Even in the face of persecution, prejudice, and demonization, the rituals continued to be practiced, passed down from generation to generation. Fathers taught their sons. Grandmothers initiated their granddaughters. The leaves continued to be harvested at the right time of the moon. The chants were whispered in the ears of those ready. The oracles continued to be consulted. The power of the Orishas, the Anchises, and the Vodans continued to pulsate, even if marginalized by official history. The church in turn gradually realized that it couldn't simply erase everything, and so began a phase of appropriation. Many elements of African religiosity were incorporated into local Christian practices, but without due recognition. The people's faith was shaped, mixed, and reconfigured. And to this day, in many places, you see remnants of ancestral wisdom operating alongside Christianity, often without people realizing it. But back to the root, what frightened the church so much? It was power, the strength of a people who healed themselves with their hands, with leaves, with words, the strength of a spirituality that needed no temples or clergy, that required no mediators, dogmas, or catechisms, a living, organic spirituality connected to the earth, the sky, and the heart. This could not be allowed in a system where control was essential, and so that which healed was called a curse. And today, what remains? Echoes remain. Memories remain, scattered in objects of power, in tales that survive in the interior of the continent, in toreros that still keep the flame of ancestry alive, despite all the prejudice they face. And most shocking of all is that many still repeat, without knowing it, the same discourse the colonizers planted. This is the devil's work. How many times have you heard this phrase? How many times have you, perhaps unintentionally, looked with suspicion at an African practice, an ancestral prayer, a leaf ritual, simply because you were taught that what is black, what is from the forest, what is from the drum, cannot be from God? It's time to rethink this narrative. It's time to question what we've been taught and look with new eyes at what has been hidden, because what's at stake isn't just religiosity, it's identity, it's memory, it's healing, it's reconnection. If you've made it this far, I invite you to leave a comment with the phrase, "I recognize my ancestry." And if you've ever heard something similar to what was said here, or experienced it yourself, share it with us. These stories help others awaken as well. From the moment the church realized it could not control the faith of the African people, it made a strategic but profoundly cruel decision to label as demon everything it didn't understand, everything that didn't fit into its theology, everything it couldn't control. And when we speak of African wisdom, we are talking about a universe of knowledge that transcends religion, because it touches the spiritual, the medicinal, the social, the emotional, and the sacred. It was at this moment that a systematic process of demonizing ancestry began. Everything connected to drums, leaves, orishas, chants in African languages, trance practices, and ancestor worship was classified as witchcraft, sorcery, and paganism. Not because these practices represented any real evil, but because they threatened the dominant religion's power and control structure. The church, in that colonial context, was not merely a spiritual institution, it was an arm of the empire. And to consolidate this empire, it was necessary to sever the spiritual roots of those being colonized. Can you imagine what it's like to have your own story turned into a curse? What it's like to see your God's name called the devil? What it's like to grow up hearing that what your grandmother did to heal the village children was hell's witchcraft? That the dances of your culture were demonic possession? That the chants of your land needed to be silenced because they offended the holiness of the new white god? This isn't just spiritual oppression, it's a mutilation of the soul. And the most perverse thing of all is that this was done in the name of salvation, in the name of God, in the name of civilization. Colonial records make this clear. In many documents, priests describe their journeys through African villages as veritable spiritual battles against the forces of evil that, in their view, were present in every healing ritual, in every cult of the Orishas, in every symbol other than the Christian cross. But the evil was not in the people's practices. The evil was in their blind judgment, in the arrogance of a faith that refused to listen, to learn, to respect. There are reports in letters from missionaries who claim to have felt evil presences when entering sacred African toreros. But what they felt wasn't evil, it was power, the spiritual strength of a people who knew who they were, knew where they came from, knew who they were with. This presence, strong and alive, did not bow to fear or imposition. And this is what sparked the church's fury, because as long as there was a connection with the ancestors, there would be no total submission. Cultural and religious censorship was brutal. In many African countries, rituals were banned by law. Sacred instruments such as drums and atabaques were confiscated. The original liturgical languages were replaced by European ones. African names were erased, replaced by Christian ones. And the worst part, people were convinced that what they carried within them was sinful. They were taught to be ashamed of their own blood, to hide their faith, to deny their origins. The demonization of African wisdom wasn't just external, it infiltrated their consciences. Many converted Africans began to repeat the same rhetoric used by the colonizers, now against their own brothers and sisters. And so, a cycle of self-denial was reinforced, generation after generation. Children grew up learning that Exu was the devil, that Osane was a witch, that Yemanja was a sea mermaid linked to evil spirits. This shaped an entire society disconnected from its roots, and we still feel the effects today. And don't think all this is in the past. This demonization echoes to this day. Just look at the prejudice against religions of African origin. Just see how syncretism was used to hide the Orishas behind images of Catholic saints. This wasn't a spiritual choice, it was survival. It was the only way that people found to keep their faith alive without being persecuted, imprisoned, or killed. Did you know that to worship Iansa, you had to say you were venerating Saint Barbara? That Ogum became Saint George? That Oxala became Jesus? This wasn't religious integration. It was camouflage. It was spiritual defense on a symbolic battlefield. And even with all this, African wisdom has survived, because it's not just in books. It's in the body, in the blood, in the memory, in the leaves, in the sounds, in the dreams. And no matter how much they try to erase it, it always returns, because it's alive, it's ancestral, it's spiritual. And maybe you're feeling this now. Maybe this truth is awakening something within you, a memory, a calling, a sense that there's more to the spiritual world than you've been told, that there's wisdom where you were once told there was darkness, that there's light where you were taught to see darkness. And this light comes from your ancestry. It comes from your roots. It comes from a past that needs to be remembered so that the future can be more whole. That's why it's so important that you're here. What we're doing in this video isn't just telling a forgotten story. We're doing spiritual justice. We're giving voice to those who have been silenced. We're remembering knowledge that heals, that liberates, that restores the soul of an entire people. And this is where I want to invite you to reflect with me. What do you feel when you hear names like Exu, Ogum, Yemanja, and Obalue? What's the first reaction you were taught? Fear? Judgment? Distrust? If so, know that it's not your fault. This was taught, programmed, imposed. But now you have the chance to reprogram this vision, to open space within yourself for a new spiritual perception, a deeper, freer perception, more connected to the truth. If this passage resonated with you, if you felt something begin to stir within you, write the phrase, "Ancestral wisdom lives within me," in the comments. And if you've ever gone through a process of spiritual liberation, where you had to deconstruct everything you were told about your faith, share it here too. Others need to hear it. They need to know they're not alone on this journey. After centuries of silencing, persecution, and misinformation, there comes a time when the truth begins to assert itself, even if subtly, discreetly, but absolutely indisputable. There is evidence that simply can no longer be ignored. History has tried to hide it, religion has tried to deny it, and science, for a long time, didn't even bother to look. But still, the stories persist. Healings continue to happen. And what was once dismissed as superstition is beginning, little by little, to reveal itself as legitimate, profound, and transformative spiritual knowledge. There are records, yes, real testimonies, stories lived by people who would never have imagined finding relief from their suffering through practices considered primitive by the Western world. But they did, and there were many. Diseases that didn't respond to any conventional treatment disappeared after ancestral rituals. Chronic symptoms disappeared after leaf baths, chants of Orishas, and reconnection with ancestors. And the most surprising thing is that these accounts come from people from the most diverse backgrounds, including doctors, psychologists, and therapists who, at some point, set aside skepticism and allowed themselves to delve into the invisible. Imagine a woman diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, debilitated and emotionally broken, after years of trying treatments with harsh medications, painful side effects, and no progress. One day, at the suggestion of a family member, she participates in a ritual with a priestess of African tradition. There, she is bathed in sacred leaves, hears ancestral chants, has her pains addressed, her lineage honored, and her spiritual energy reorganized. What happens next is not magic, but it is real. The body begins to respond. The fever subsides. The seizures subside. The woman sleeps for the first time in weeks. Days later, her tests show something that even doctors can't explain. And you might think, coincidence? Suggestion? Placebo? Maybe. But when thousands of coincidences repeat themselves in the same way over the centuries, it's a sign that we're not talking about chance. We're talking about ancestral truth. There are reports in Afro-descendant communities across Latin America, the Caribbean, and Brazil, where children with severe epilepsy stopped having seizures after spiritual initiations. People with chronic body pain were cured after just 3 sessions of blessing with leaves and chanted prayers. Young people experiencing psychotic episodes were welcomed into trance rituals, where, under the guidance of guides, they were able to express their anguish, regain their consciousness, and resume their lives with stability. And all this far from doctors' offices, far from hospitals, far from chemical prescriptions, but deeply close to the soul. This isn't about dismissing traditional medicine. It's important, necessary, and life-saving in many cases. But it must be stated clearly, true healing is multidimensional. And African wisdom understands this like no other. It understands that liver pain can be the manifestation of old anger, that a recurring infection can be a reflection of stagnant energy, that a recurring illness is often a request from the soul for something to be addressed, transformed, and healed on the invisible plane. And that's why even science, slowly, is starting to pay attention. There are researchers today, at reputable universities, studying the effects of herbal baths on the nervous system. Others are analyzing the relationship between ritual chants and the release of neurotransmitters in the brain. There are already scientific articles showing how practicing gratitude to ancestors improves serotonin levels and reduces anxiety. And although many of these studies are still considered alternative, they are gaining traction because the results speak for themselves. And the most fascinating thing is that the more science investigates, the more it finds modern explanations for ancient practices. For example, leaf baths considered strong in the Orisha tradition often involve plants with anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, and calming properties, and not by chance. The priests don't choose these plants instinctively. They are guided by knowledge that comes from oracles, dreams, ancestors, and energies. And this knowledge is now being confirmed by modern science. How can we deny it? How can we deny the effectiveness of a ritual where a person feels heard, spiritually touched, welcomed into a field of collective faith? How can we disregard the power of a torero where everyone prays around a sick person, connecting with natural forces in total surrender to the invisible? Healing happens, even without equipment, scalpels, or formulas. Because it isn't limited to the body, it enters the soul and spreads like light into every cell. This evidence now beginning to surface is nothing new to those who carry on the tradition. The ancients have always known. The elders have always said, whoever has a leaf has a cure. And it wasn't a metaphor, it was experience. It was wisdom passed down by word of mouth, from generation to generation, because books were denied. But the living word always endured. And today, this word is being remembered. It is returning. It is resurfacing. It is occupying digital spaces, urban altars, awakened hearts. And maybe you're feeling it inside you right now. A restlessness, a recognition, a memory you didn't even know you had. Maybe you were taught to doubt it all, but now, something inside you says, it makes sense. This isn't crazy. This is true. This is what was missing. So, once again, I invite you to break the silence, to take a stand, to leave a comment here saying, I believe in ancestral healing. Or, if you've had an experience of spiritual healing that medicine couldn't explain, share it with us. Your story may be what someone else needs to hear to allow them to seek their own healing. When we look with clear eyes, free from indoctrination, and open to spiritual revelation, we realize that many sacred stories we learn from Scripture carry deep echoes of the experiences of ancestral peoples who were unjustly labeled. The Bible, when read with sensitivity, reveals surprising parallels between the healings performed by Jesus and the healing rituals of African traditions that were persecuted and demonized. And most striking of all, Jesus was often accused of exactly what was used to attack African healers, prophets, and priests, of operating by the power of the devil. Yes, it's written. It's right there in the gospel. The Pharisees themselves, religious leaders of the time, looked at Jesus' healing actions and, faced with what they couldn't explain, accused him of casting out demons through Beelzebub, the prince of evil spirits. And this accusation says much more about the heart of the one making it than about the spirit of the one healing. Jesus responded wisely and firmly, "How can Satan cast out Satan? No kingdom divided against itself cannot stand." Jesus' logic was simple, profound, and relentless. Good cannot come from evil. And if the fruit is good, so is the tree. Now stop and think with me. How many times has this logic been ignored when it comes to African gods? How many times has the good fruit of healing, liberation, spiritual relief, and profound transformation been overlooked simply because the practice wasn't part of the institutional Christian package? How many times have Black men and women with genuine spiritual gifts, with a direct connection to the unseen world, been accused of witchcraft, sorcery, and demonic possession, just as they accused Jesus? And here lies the most tragic irony of all. Those who claim to follow in Christ's footsteps often repeat the mistakes of the Pharisees. They judge by what they don't understand. They attack what they don't know. They label as evil that which doesn't fit within their mold. And they forget that the true Christ manifested himself where the religious system couldn't reach. He touched the untouchable. He healed on the Sabbath. He mingled with sinners. And he performed miracles that disturbed the powerful of faith. And what did African healers do? They touched the marginalized. They healed without charge. They used sacred leaves and words to restore the spirit. They connected with forces greater than any temple. And for this, they were persecuted. They were condemned. They were silenced, just as the Master was. What separates Jesus' healing rituals from many African healing rituals is not the intention or the effect. It's just the name and the cultural trappings. But the essence, the dedication, the spirituality, these are universal. In several biblical passages, we see Jesus using simple elements of nature to heal. He spat on the ground, made mud, and smeared it on the blind man's eyes. He touched, he breathed, he laid hands, he prayed with authority. There was no apparatus, there was no formal liturgy. There was a direct connection with the divine. There was faith, energy, a living word. How is this different from an African healer who prays over a leaf, blows on an infusion of roots, and sings in connection with the sacred? Could it be that what we call a miracle, when performed in the name of Jesus, is not the same as what we call witchcraft when performed in the name of Osanyan or an ancestor? Perhaps the problem isn't in the practice itself, but in the way we've been taught to see it. Perhaps the problem lies in the filter, and this filter has been constructed over centuries based on interests of power, colonization, domination, and silencing. If Jesus lived today and was an African healer, would he be recognized as the Son of God? Or would he be arrested for charlatanism, religious disturbance, or the crime of witchcraft? The question is uncomfortable but necessary, because the great truth is that we have reproduced the error of ancient religious leaders without realizing it. We judge by appearances. We reject what is different. We call profane what we don't understand. And we forget that the Spirit blows where it wills, that the divine reveals itself in the most unexpected ways, that God does not fit into a doctrine, nor a temple, nor a culture. He is greater than that. He is before all. There's a passage where Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, many will come from east and west, and will recline at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven." In other words, he already knew that salvation, this connection with the sacred, would not be exclusive to one group. He opened the kingdom to those with a pure heart, a living faith, and a willingness to love and serve. And if this applies to everyone, then it also applies to the African peoples, their rights, their Orishas, and their unique and powerful way of connecting with the divine. And if we return to the beginning of this video, to that provocative question that has guided us thus far, what if what the church called a demon was actually an ancient healing power? Perhaps now you're ready to look at this question with new eyes, with the eyes of conscience, with the eyes of the Spirit, because history needs to be retold, judgments need to be revisited, and spiritual gifts that have been extinguished need to be restored. Do you realize how profound this is? How conditioned we've been to repeat speeches without question, how manipulated our faith has been to distance us from ourselves. And that's why these videos, these conversations, this journey is so important. We're rebuilding bridges. We're freeing memories. We're reuniting what was separated by centuries of domination. And if this resonates with you, if some part of your soul is saying this is true, even if you don't yet understand everything, then this is the time to give it a voice. Comment below with the phrase, "Jesus was also judged," if you felt this connection. Or if you prefer, share a reflection on how this parallel between African healers and Jesus' miracles made you think differently. Over the centuries, many names have been used to define what was not understood. And among all these names, perhaps the most dangerous and misused has been demon, a word loaded with fear, dread, and rejection, which, when used, closes doors, blocks paths, and interrupts dialogue. But have we ever stopped to think deeply? Who were, in fact, the true demons of history? Or rather, who labeled them this way, and why? When we observe honestly, with eyes free from colonial filters, we realize that much of what was labeled evil was actually a legitimate and sacred way of connecting with the divine through African roots. The Orishas, the enchanted ones, the guides, the ancestors, all these names that today evoke fear in many Christians were, for centuries, demonized not for their content, but for their origin. And that says a lot. The fear the institutional church felt wasn't of evil itself. It was of the spiritual power of a people who didn't need the church to heal, to strengthen, to connect with the sacred. It was a fear rooted in control, in domination, in the need to centralize access to God. And when this God manifested himself outside the temples, in the forests, in rivers, at crossroads, in the hands of a Meda Santo or a candomblé priest, it was seen as a threat. And the threat was combated with a label, demon. But stop and think. When a deity that heals, liberates, and welcomes is called a demon, who is truly working against the divine, who opposes love, care, and ancestral truth? When the leaf that heals is burned by priests, when the drum that awakens is silenced by doctrines, When the body that dances is censored by dogma, who is truly serving the darkness? The truth that history didn't tell, or rather tried to hide, is that the real demons were not in African rituals, but in the holds of colonization, on slave ships, in torture, at the stake, in the ignorance that masqueraded as holiness to silence what it didn't understand. It was prejudice, greed, and fear of the unknown that shaped this distorted idea of spirituality. And what hurts most is realizing how much we lose by rejecting this knowledge. We lose our connection with nature, with our bodies, with our intuition, with our ancestors. We lose the wisdom of silence, of touch, of breath, of the scent of leaves at dawn. We lose the ability to hear the signs of the invisible, to trust dreams, to interpret winds, paths, and encounters. We lose access to a medicine for the soul. By calling something ancestral evil, we disconnect from our own roots. And a tree without roots, no matter how tall, is always on the verge of falling. Colonizing Christianity cut these roots violently, with a whip, with a cross. And even today, many continue to replicate this cut. Within many evangelical churches, it is still taught that any spiritual practice not under the seal of the institutional Bible is the work of the enemy. But the enemy, in this case, is fear. The true evil is ignorance. And have you ever stopped to think that perhaps the true miracle was silenced by sheer fear of the unknown? That perhaps the answers you sought within traditional religion were long within you, but you weren't taught to look within. You were taught to seek outside, to depend on intermediaries, to fear the touch of nature, the whisper of ancestors, the power that pulses in your own bones. And when we look back at the communities where African spirituality has endured, even through persecution, even through pain, even through exile, what we see is a silent miracle, continuity, knowledge that never dies, healing that endures, faith that is renewed in resistance. Therefore, the great reflection here is not just about religion, but about identity. Who are we without our roots? Who do we become when we reject what our ancestors gave us with love and courage? What kind of spirituality are we experiencing when we call the very thing that heals us a demon? And if today we have the chance to retell this story, to open our eyes, to question, to redeem, then we also have the responsibility to do so with truth, respect, and depth. We are not here to argue with religion, but to remember that the sacred is greater than any doctrine, that God speaks all languages, uses all bodies, manifests himself in all cultures, and that to deny this is to deny the Creator himself. Perhaps you're feeling a mix of things inside right now: discomfort, relief, anger, hope, and all of this is valid, because awakening hurts, but it also liberates. And this video is an invitation to do just that, to look at what was called evil and find there the forgotten face of the divine. If this passage touched you, if it awakened something that was dormant, comment below with the phrase, "I'm no longer afraid of my ancestry," or if you prefer, share a phrase that represents this new perspective you're developing. It could be as simple as, "I see things with different eyes now." Your words help others find the courage to do the same. If you've made it this far, it's because this message resonated within you. And that already says a lot about your spiritual journey, about your courage to look beyond what you've been taught. Now, I want to invite you to strengthen this connection with our community. Subscribe to the channel now. Here, each video is a deeper step toward the truth that has been silenced for centuries. And since you stayed until the end, comment below, "I made it to the end because my soul asked for it." This phrase will show that you are part of the group that doesn't shy away from the truth, that faces the invisible with respect, with courage, with a thirst for liberation. Leave a like too. It's the simplest way to tell YouTube, this content needs to reach more people. And if you want to continue this journey with me, click on the video now. It's the continuation of this journey and will open even more paths within you. See you there. Akse.